Well, isn't this bizarre? Not just the way we're talking, but what we're talking about, really. We are here to talk about Brexit and Boris, and yet all that feels almost like you're talking about the Roman Empire so long ago, it seems. But it is still worth doing it, it seems to me, because the themes in this seminar, the themes that are outlined in the book that accompanies it, will still be relevant after the great crisis is all over. Now, I've known Boris Johnson since we were students together, since we debated together, since we were hacks together. I made one big mistake through most of that time. It's a mistake I think a lot of people continue to make. I didn't really take him seriously enough. All that changed when one day I bumped into Boris, as we used to be happy to call him, walking through the House of Commons just after he'd announced that he was going to run for Parliament. And I remember asking why turn back on a glittering journalistic career as editor of The Spectator and star columnist in The Telegraph, on growing fame and fortune after starring on Have I Got News for You? Why turn you back on all that for the relative obscurity, powerlessness and the low pay of being a backbench MP? Now, I'll never forget how he replied. It was without the faintest flicker of a smile. What we do, he said to me, talking journalist to journalist, it's all too easy, isn't it, Nick? We don't actually change anything very much, do we? Now, many in the media have long assumed that Boris is essentially not serious about anything other than power for himself. And since he's one of us, that he won't seek to challenge the journalistic culture that he used to be part of. And my contention is they, maybe you, couldn't be more wrong. That's why I tell this story, because it's increasingly clear to me that since becoming Prime Minister, Boris Johnson has hardened in his belief that the British media has to change or be changed. And the events analysed in this book have him at the centre. They've convinced him, they've convinced his colleagues, I think, that his old colleagues in the guild of hacks and scribblers and pundits and allied trades hold up a pretty distorted mirror to the country. And what we all see in that mirror holds the country back, they think. What we saw in the run-up to Brexit, the election that followed and the events that followed after the election and before this coronavirus crisis, was a power struggle between politicians and journalists over the control of the news agenda, the right to hold those in authority to account, of course, allegations of bias too. Now, none of that can be described as new, can it? After all, way back in the 1770s, it was Lord North who had those who dared to print the accounts of the House of Commons debate thrown into prison. And more recently, but early days of my organisation, the BBC, it was Winston Churchill who berated the new British Broadcasting Corporation in 1926 for being impartial between the firemen and the fire during the general strike. So in one sense, nothing has changed at all, but so much has, of course. What is new? Well, it's the structure and the shape and the form of our politics and of our media. Politics, once dominated by parties and their HQs and their staff, now are not in charge. We live now in an era of personalities and their pop-up campaigns. So Johnson and the Vote Leave crowd, Corbyn and Momentum, Farage and the Brexit Party. And that last one proved that parties could rise and fall as quicker as your average souffle, but still have much longer lasting effects. Now, this change posed a real problem for we broadcasters, who are, let's never forget, obliged by all of us, BBC, ITN, Sky, all the rest, to be impartial. Now, once that felt pretty simple, it just simply meant broad balance between two big parties. But at the last election, in 2019, it required the BBC and ITV and Sky to take advice about how to stage TV election debates, taking into account, on the one hand, the dominance of the SNP in one part of this still United Kingdom against a far from insignificant presence all over England, Wales and Scotland for the Liberal Democrats, for the Brexit Party, for the Greens. And to make things even, we broadcasters were harangued daily, not by simply party representatives, but also champions for Leave and Remain. To give you one example, you may remember this: Philip Hammond, the Chancellor who campaigned for Remain, but was now serving in a government committed to take it out of the EU, there was a debate: should it be treated as a remainer or a leaver? No surprise, really, that no agreement on that was ever found. Indeed, there was no agreement on very much between the two sides of the argument that had divided the country into angry, bawling, and all too often abusive factions. Now, politics really had changed, in my view, because the media had changed. A decade or more after it was a cliche that broadcast media was dying or had died as the dominant means of communication for politicians, we finally discovered that it might not be hyperbole. TV and radio, yes, of course, continued to command huge audiences, but it was YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, Snap, and all the rest of it that opened up opportunities for the politicians to broadcast without the assistance or the filter or the scrutiny, indeed, of those pesky hacks and pundits and interrogators. Long before the EU referendum, it is worth remembering that Boris Johnson had already described my own organisation, the BBC, as statist, defeatist, and biased. And during the election, where he secured that comfortable majority, he then went to war with the BBC, refusing to be interviewed by Andrew Neil famously. And the lesson that he and his advisors took from that whole row was they didn't have to follow the rules. They could do things their own way and win. The public didn't much care, they concluded. Now, after the election, a newly empowered Downing Street then chose to boycott my programme, the Today programme, but not just us, also Piers Morgan on GMB as well. They sought to divide the parliamentary lobby into an inner and an outer circle, to exclude papers that they didn't much like. And some in the Prime Minister's circle began to dream, in the case of Dominic Cummings, of something he'd written about many years before, of creating a British equivalent to Fox News to hold up a different, alternative mirror to the nation. And with the backing of Rupert Murdoch, and who knows, help from Ofcom, or at least their acquiescence, it looked like that might happen sooner than many people thought. Now, the question this book should raise, and does raise, is what lessons we in the media can learn from the success of Boris and Brexit. I think the wrong answer is to say it's the right time to man the barricades, although we can and should, of course, make the case for journalism that scrutinises, challenges and holds to account. We can, we should argue against the destruction of the British media model, which is admired throughout so much of the rest of the world. And it is so much better than the American alternative, raucous, partisan, and all too often fact-free. However, in my view, we should take the opportunity for some self-examination and self-reflection. We need to ask why most pundits, most poll watchers, people like me, didn't see Brexit, or for that matter, Corbyn coming. We should challenge more vigorously the bias that, in my view, has blighted the mass media for decades. Not a bias in favour of one set of views or another, one party or another, a bias in favour of conventional wisdom. And we ought to find new ways of engaging with politicians and political ideas that extend beyond an interrogation or a grilling. Finally, perhaps study and learn from what you might call the Boris Heineken effect if you're of the right age. In other words, his ability to reach the parts that others cannot reach. In short, we need to see the new world as an opportunity and not a threat. The old saying goes that it takes one to know one. Boris Johnson, columnist, editor, hack, came to a view about what's wrong with the media from which he sprung. And it's our challenge now to learn from ourselves. This crisis is already changing some of what this book is about. The Today programme has been unboycotted. There is a different tone to political conversation at the moment. But the fundamental questions about Boris, Brexit and the media remain as important to answer and as fascinating as ever. What we do, he said to me, talking journalist to journalist, it's all too easy, isn't it, Nick? We don't actually change anything very much, do we? Now, many in the media have long assumed that Boris is essentially not serious about anything other than power for himself. And since he's one of us, that he won't seek to challenge the journalistic culture that he used to be part of. And my contention is they, maybe you, couldn't be more wrong. That's why I tell this story, because increasingly clear to me that since becoming Prime Minister, Boris Johnson has hardened in his belief that the British media has to change or be changed. And the events analysed in this book have him at the centre. They've convinced him, they've convinced his colleagues, I think, that his old colleagues in the guild of hacks and scribblers and pundits and allied trades hold up a pretty distorted mirror to the country. And what we all see in that mirror holds the country back, they think. What we saw in the run-up to Brexit, the election that followed and the events that followed after the election and before this coronavirus crisis was a power struggle between politicians and journalists over the control of the news agenda, the right to hold those in to account. Of course, allegations of bias too. Now, none of that can be described as new, can it? After all, way back in the 1770s, it was Lord North who had those who dared to print the accounts of the House of Commons debate thrown into prison. And more recently, but early days of my organisation, the BBC, it was Winston Churchill who berated the new British Broadcasting Corporation in 1926 for being impartial between the firemen and the fire during the general strike. Nothing has changed at all, but so much has, of course. What is new? Well, it's the structure and the shape and the form of our politics and of our media. Politics, once dominated by parties and their HQs and their staff, now are not in charge. We live now in an era of personalities and their pop-up campaigns. So Johnson and the Vote Leave crowd, Corbyn and Momentum, Farage and the Brexit Party. And that last one proved that parties could rise and fall as quicker as your average souffle, but still have much longer lasting effects. Now, this change posed a real problem for we broadcasters, who are, let's never forget, obliged by all of us, BBC, ITN, Sky, all the rest, to be impartial. Now, once that felt pretty simple, it just simply meant broad balance between two big parties. But at the last election, in 2019, it required the BBC and ITV and Sky to take advice about how to stage TV election debates, taking into account, on the one hand, the dominance of the SNP in one part of this still United Kingdom against a far from insignificant presence all over England, Wales and Scotland for the Liberal Democrats, for the Brexit Party, for the Greens. And to make things even, we broadcasters were harangued daily, not by simply party representatives, but also champions for Leave and Remain. To give you one example, you may remember this: Philip Hammond, the Chancellor who campaigned for Remain, but was now serving in a government committed to take it out of the EU. There was a debate: should be treated as a Remainer or a Leaver. No surprise, really, that no agreement on that was ever found. Indeed, there was no agreement on very much between the two sides of the argument that had divided the country into angry, bawling, and all too often abusive factions. Now, politics really had changed, in my view, because the media had changed. A decade or more after it was a cliche that broadcast media was dying or had died as the dominant means of communication for politicians, we finally discovered that it might not be hyperbole. TV and radio, yes, of course, continued to command huge audiences, but it was YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, Snap, and all the rest of it that opened up opportunities for the politics without the assistance or the filter or the scrutiny, indeed, of those pesky hacks and pundits and interrogators. Long before the EU referendum, it is worth remembering that Boris Johnson had already described my own organisation, the BBC, as statist, defeatist and biased. And during the election, where he secured that comfortable majority, he then went to war with the BBC, refusing to be interviewed by Andrew Neil, famously. And the lesson that he and his advisors took from that whole row was they didn't have to follow the rules. They could do things their own way and win. The public didn't much care, they concluded. Now, after the election, a newly empowered Downing Street then chose to boycott my programme, the Today programme, but not just us, also Piers Morgan on GMB as well. They sought to divide the parliamentary lobby into an inner and an outer circle, to exclude papers that they didn't much like. And some in the Prime Minister's circle began to dream, in the case of Dominic Cummings, of something he'd written about many years before, of creating a British equivalent to Fox News to hold up a different, alternative mirror to the nation. And with the backing of Rupert Murdoch and, who knows, help from Ofcom, or at least their acquiescence, it looked like that might happen sooner than many people thought. Now, the question this book should raise, and does raise, is what lessons we in the media can learn from the success of Boris and Brexit. I think the wrong answer is to say it's the right time to man the barricades, although we could, can and should, of course, make the case for journalism that scrutinises, challenges and holds to account. We can, we should argue against the destruction of the British media model, which is admired throughout so much of the rest of the world, and it is so much better than the American alternative, raucous, partisan, and all too often fact-free. However, in my view, we should take the opportunity for some self-examination and self-reflection. We need to ask why most pundits, most poll watchers, people like me, didn't see Brexit, or for that matter, Corbyn coming. We should challenge more vigorously the bias that, in my view, has blighted the mass media for decades. Not a bias in favour of one set of views or another, one party or another, a bias in favour of conventional wisdom. And we ought to find new ways of engaging with politicians and political ideas that extend beyond an interrogation or a grilling. Finally, perhaps study and learn from what you might call the Boris Heineken effect, if you're of the right age. In other words, his ability to reach the parts that others cannot reach. We need to see the new world as an opportunity and not a threat. The old saying goes that it takes one to know one. Boris Johnson, columnist, editor, hack, came to a view about what's wrong with the media from which he sprung. And it's our challenge now to learn from ourselves. This crisis is already changing some of what this book is about. The Today programme has been unboycotted. There is a different tone to political conversation at the moment. But the fundamental questions about Boris, Brexit and the media remain as important to answer and as fascinating as ever.
Well, I'm joined by Ray Snoddy and Jane Martinson. Boris is the media prime minister, is he? Is he the ultimate media monster?
Yeah, I mean, is he the media prime minister? What has surprised me, I would have said until a month ago, Boris Johnson is the luckiest politician on earth. He almost slid his way into Downing Street because the Labour Party had basically an unelectable leader. The Lib Dems had imploded and were no longer a plausible candidate for tactical voting. And Boris Johnson simply became Prime Minister by running around repeating an end. Oh, and the other problem was even some Remainers were so fed up within the Brexit negotiations that the slogan "Get Brexit Done" resonated all around the country, particularly in the former Labour strongholds of the Northwest and the Northeast. I don't think Boris Johnson is a lucky politician anymore. He's been hit by something completely out of the blue, of a nature no Prime Minister in modern times has had to face, and which no Prime Minister would do well at. But the surprising thing is that Boris, the great journalist, the great media comedian, is suddenly exposed as not very good. Very little command of detail. When he can't do his palette of jokes and Latinisms, and totally falls to the scientists on either side of them because he doesn't know what he's talking about. I'm afraid the man is rather exposed as the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Jane Martinson, formerly The Guardian and now at City. Is Boris the ultimate media monster, media prime minister?
I mean, I agree with Ray, actually. What's interesting about this debate, that you know, the book was written obviously about Brexit and about the referendum and how, you know, cometh the man, cometh the moment. And what COVID-19 has revealed is you can't just work on slogans. You have to bring in the experts. You have to deliver clear and impressive thoughts. As Nick has just outlined, there are lots of questions for the media to ask themselves, but I think it's wrong to suggest that Boris is in any way lucky at this point. He's facing something the likes of which has not been seen, well, certainly not in my lifetime, and nobody else is listening, I can imagine. So, these are exceptional times. Do we have an exceptional Prime Minister? It's not looking like that right at the moment, but it's very early days.
What?
Jane, it may be early days, but there's one slightly surprising thing. You would have thought an accomplished journalist and broadcaster, and supposedly a literary gent on the side, would the very least be able to come out with a clear message that would unite the country in such a time of crisis. He's done no such thing. And indeed, some of the broadcasters have played clips from other leaders, like the Irish Prime Minister, who appealed to their country in the most eloquent terms to stay together and we'll win this. Boris has he hasn't tried to crack jokes, thank God.
No, he hasn't.
He's just blustering. He's not offering clarity or leadership, in my view.
Jane.
No, I disagree even about the jokes. What I found amazing is that he hasn't come up with the pithy sayings that would lead the nation, would understand. I mean, somebody on Twitter today, a letter in the Times, Alan Rusbridger referred to it. Somebody, his wife had said, better 6 feet apart than 6 foot under. Not only has the government not come up with anything like that, but the things that Johnson has come up with, are things like, it does seem as if we're stopping the Englishman's inalienable right to go to the pub. What is that?
That was his father, to be fair.
Well, he repeated it, actually.
So has Dominic Cummings lost his magic touch, do you think, on this?
Oh, I do hope so.
Oh, he had a magic touch on the election and on Brexit. Has he lost it now?
Yes, simple slogans. Nothing quite like this. I really wonder whether Boris will survive this. This government will survive. It's got a large majority, but I'm afraid with every day it passes, you hear other Tory politicians, the former ministers on the back benches, like Jeremy Hunt, former Health Secretary, former Foreign Minister, coming out with the real detailed questions, the real detailed issues that need to be addressed. And God knows, I never thought Jeremy Hunt was an orator, but compared with Boris, he's doing terribly well. And on the Tory backbenches, I think they might be noticing that, don't you, with every day that passes?
Jane, has Dom lost his magic touch?
Well, can I just say, though, I do think at this point, and we have to be careful, I suppose that the key point, really, is the slogans and the messaging were about electioneering and about one side versus the other. I think what we have now, and why the Times wrote that leader today, which they actually, was really damning about Johnson. This feels like a wartime. This is the country as a whole. It really doesn't matter whether you voted for Boris Johnson. We need him to come up with the messages that will keep us and our loved ones safe. And for that, you need more than Dominic Cummings, actually. I mean, Ray mentioned Jeremy Hunt. I would say, there are people, whether that's Tony Blair or Gordon Brown or John Major or Ken Clark, people with lots of experience of international cooperation, he needs to be reaching out, creating some kind of, I've just come up with men, and there are lots of women who could do that too, who could actually work together with messaging that makes a difference. That surely, the media should be holding him to account on that, not whether he's a good Conservative politician. In a way, the last thing the country needs is for him to not be Prime Minister, because we need action, and we need action by people who know what they're doing.
Is he out of his depth, do you think, both of you?
I didn't hear that.
Is he out of his depth? Is Boris out of his depth?
To be fair to him, and I think possibly people might say I'm not often fair to Boris, but I'm no particular fan. I don't think many people are feeling like they're comfortably swimming in this. This is unprecedented. It's an overused word at the moment, but he probably Johnson is out of his depth, but aren't we all? I mean, this is an incredibly difficult time. Again, he doesn't seem to be rising to the challenge at the moment, and we need something to happen quite soon, I think.
Ray out of his depth?
I don't know whether he's out of his depth or not, but certainly he isn't performing as he should. Where have been the sophisticated advertising campaigns telling the country where to go? But clearly, a lot of them haven't got the message, as we've seen by the general public behaviour on Sunday. The message really hasn't got through as it should have done, and I just don't think he's going to have to up his game pretty damn fast. But unfortunately, he was not helped by backing perhaps the wrong scientific advice for 2 or 3 critical weeks, and then reversing himself. And I mean, as I say, I'm all for the liberal arts, but having liberal arts graduates in charge at a time like this is maybe not the best thing in the world.
Okay, let's move on and backwards to Brexit if we can. Now, one of the people who observed Brexit best were the foreign correspondents in London. They were strangers in a land that they thought they were citizens of. We've got here some testimony from one of them, a lady called Antetomaso, who will tell you about what happened to her the day after Brexit and what's happened since. She's taken the advice to heart. Let's see if we can get this one.
Hello, I'm Angela Antetomaso, and I've been an Italian correspondent in London for many, many years, for about 20 years actually, even if in the last few months my life has changed quite a lot. I've always been very, very happy in London. I always loved the city, I loved the buzz, I loved everything. And my life has been quite happy, my career quite happy, up until the 23rd of June 2016, the day of the referendum. When I heard the results on the TV, I knew my life was going to change. It was very, very sad, but I still thought, I'm a Londoner, I've been in London for so long, this is home for me, I've been working, paying taxes, everything is okay, it's going to be well, it's going to be fine. But it took only a few months for me to realize in the worst possible way that things were not going to be the same. And this happened one day while I was going to work. I was going by bus from Chelsea to St. Paul's Cathedral, where I used to work. And I was all nicely made up and dressed, nicely dressed. I was, again, ready to go on air as soon as I arrived there, just with a little touch-up and everything. But halfway through, I was around Westminster, very close to Westminster Abbey, while I was in the bus, minding my own business, reading my emails on my iPhone and everything. An elderly gentleman just came up to me and with a smile said to me, "Hello, lovely lady, where are you from?" And I smiled back and I just said, "Where do you think I'm from?" He said, "I don't know, probably Greece, Spain, Italy." I said, "Yeah, I'm from Italy." And at that point it changed completely. And he just started shouting at me and telling me, "What the hell are you doing here? Go back to your country, you're not welcome." And useless to say, I was absolutely in shock. People around me were, looking at the scene without saying anything. Nobody helped, nobody, came up, just to say anything. It was very, very sad for me. And in absolute shock, I decided to leave the bus and just started walking to work. But that was the moment my life really changed, to be honest, because that stayed inside me. It was very, very hard for me to discuss it, to talk about it even with my family. I didn't speak to my husband about it. I didn't tell him about it. I didn't tell my friends initially. It was very difficult to deal with, having been abused because I'm Italian. And, after so many years of working in London and again, paying taxes and living, at home, feeling and being at home in London, that was absolutely terrible. So months went by and I started talking about it little by little, but sadness and the anger, stayed inside me. I could see that things were different now. I didn't feel so much at home anymore. I didn't feel so happy. Had to keep on reporting about Brexit every day on air, so it wasn't really very easy for me. And then, I ended up being asked to write a part of this book, Do They Mean Us? The View of the Foreign Correspondents in London, and I happily wrote it. So that's when my story really finally completely came out, and that helped me a lot. Actually, at that point, I even had people asking me for interviews, and I started telling my story, finally telling my story, taking it all out, and that really helped a lot. I had to say that that was not enough though. And so a few months after that, something else came my way that really helped me to heal in a way. There was this new party, pro-European party. They were looking for candidates for the upcoming European parliamentary elections. That was last April 2019. And I was asked if I wanted to join them. I didn't think twice, actually. I never been one for politics, but I knew everything about politics. I've been reporting about it for years and years and years. So that was easy in a way. So I just said, yes, let's try. So very hastily put together all the documents and everything. We were really running, against time to be ready for the elections. And it was a fantastic time. I find myself talking at hustings, debating my ideas with other people or different ideas as well. I find myself, giving out flyers in the streets, speaking to people in the streets. It was a fantastic experience. I was not elected. We all know how the elections went. Anyway, the Brexit party was sweeping away all the votes, or most of the votes anyway. And there was not much chance for a new party, and mostly for someone foreigner like me. But that was a fantastic time of my life. And I have to say that the party was incredibly supportive. There was a moment they even considered having me standing as a candidate for the London mayor election 2020. I was absolutely, shocked again. In this case, I didn't expect this. But I was absolutely happy. I considered this. It was, very difficult for me to be elected and anything. But they insisted, they discussed it with my husband. We decided to, start thinking about it after all. But it didn't go through. And the main reason is that something else very important came my way. In this case, actually, it came to my husband's way because the company he has been working for a few years, it's an American company, and they were just looking for someone like him in the United States. So he, was offered a job in the US, and we had to choose between me, kind of trying to, or at least be a candidate for the mayor elections in London, leaving everything behind. And I had to say, I knew that they will be elected as a mayor in London, even if it was a fantastic opportunity. And at the same time, the idea of leaving behind the mess was very, very appealing. So we decided to try. And I spoke to my boss, and actually I asked him if it's possible for me to be a correspondent from New York rather than from London. And he was happy for me to be. So here I am. I have to say, I'm still, back and forth between London and New York. So I didn't leave London completely. It's never going to be possible for me to leave London completely because London has been my home for over 20 years and I absolutely love it. But things have changed. And in the past few months, we went through all the legal proceedings and everything. They interviewed the American embassy. We got the visa, and here we are. We are in New York now. So even if at the moment we go through this tough time with the coronavirus, in New York, the same as in London, the same as in Italy, the same as in the rest of the world, unfortunately, our life has dramatically changed, and my life has dramatically changed. And all of this because of Brexit. I would never, ever have expected to be here in New York, where actually my career started many years ago. I started with an internship at CNN, unpaid internship at CNN. And then when I had to stay, and I was here for 1.5 years. And then after, About 20 years in London, here I am, back in the Big Apple. It's an incredible opportunity and I'm very happy to be here. I will not leave London behind. I will not forget London. As I said, they're still home and they're still going back, and then I will go back one day. But at the moment, again, the Brexit reality is a bit further away from me, and that's what really helped me to heal all the hurt and all the pain that I had when I was attacked in a bus, just because I'm Italian.
Okay, right. I'm joined again by Ray Snoddy and Jane Martinson. Harrowing tale there from an Italian journalist who was not only harassed on the bus, but actually has been harassed out of the country, has gone to New York. Jane, what does that tell you about British journalism post-Brexit?
Well, there have been attacks. Reporters without frontiers or without borders have documented increasing attacks on journalists. Definitely in the US and UK, with sort of previous bastions of freedom of the press, and this sort of behaviour, blaming the press. Obviously, we've seen it in terms of the referendum, the increasing accusations of partiality, of bias against all broadcasters, actually, not just the BBC, and an increasing sort of anger, I suppose. And I mean, there are interesting things to think about, particularly now, is that sense that the media did lose touch with, those outside our own bubble, whether that was within the M25, a particular class, that we ignored as a sort of, I say we, the media, ignored many voices that were outliers, those left behind in a way, who didn't really have a voice, weren't being heard. And so there has been this rising anger, I think. And it's awful when you hear testimony like that, but on the other hand, I think lessons have to be learned, which is what Nick said as well at the end of his video.
Ray, the book goes into lessons for journalism quite heavily. Tell us what lessons you drew, particularly from the piece by Helen Lewis.
There's one, just picking up from Jane, there's one lesson that really, you would think had already been learned. The Westminster bubble, which largely supported Remain, were absolutely astounded that the Remain cause lost. And there's a lovely chapter in the book from the former letters editor of The Guardian, who calls him, Nigel Wilmot, who calls himself one of only two or three journalists on the entire staff of The Guardian who were Leave supporters, and he describes telling me the absolute sense of shock at the result. But the point is, in the general election, as far as it's fairly clear now, that all the great political journalists of the day were very late onto the fact that the parts of the northwest and northeast were deserting Labour and were prepared to vote for Boris Johnson rather than for Jeremy Corbyn, largely because of the desire to get Brexit done. But there's another very telling chapter in the book that really resonated with me, and it's by Helen Lewis, former deputy editor of New Statesman, now writing for the Atlantic magazine, and she says journalism has gone wrong because of the desire to go for endless repetition of conventional wisdom, which means that they assume an outcome, a fixed point destination, and work backwards in their coverage. She said journalists should not be talking to someone who says it's raining outside and reporting what they say. They should be opening the window and verifying it for themselves. It's an almost folksy comment, but you know what she means. There's been too much of taking in each other's dirty washing and too little getting out there talking to people. And I'm not talking about the vacuous vox pop, where one view is immediately, particularly sadly often in the BBC, where one view is immediately countered by the opposite, and that is called balance. When no analysis, no context, no real wisdom has resulted.
Now, we've had a question in from a man called Neil Fowler up in the northeast. who is the current of you've heard of him. He says, you lot are just liberal journalists. Give Boris a chance. The people love him. Discuss.
Well, yes, I mean, I know it's very easy to smear people with the disgrace of being liberal with a small L, and people love him. Let's see how much they love him when the death rate, which is currently accelerating, and goes to Italian levels. Let's see how much love for the inaction and the delay and the false starts that has marked his handling of, albeit a crisis without any answer, of course. But to think he's done well so far is not right, in my opinion, and it's nothing to do with liberal metropolitan bias.
Jane, you were one of the majority views on The Guardian. Nigel was in a minority of two, him and Larry Elliott. How did you feel shouting people like him down on The Guardian?
Oh, we don't shout people down on The Guardian.
If we politely did it, though. Right.
No, I think it's probably unusual in The Guardian that Larry would often, and Nigel would come into conference and talk about their opinions. To be honest, I really don't think it's about whether we give Nigel and Larry a voice, given that they are senior journalists at The Guardian. What I'm really talking about is whether we give people outside the media a voice. So not just, as Ray said, opening the window and looking outside, but going to talk to people that we wouldn't necessarily talk to. Don't just talk to Dominic Cummings and Spaz, but actually go out and try to find out what people are actually saying. I mean, I sort of agree this sense that what people are looking for, I don't agree with Neil that, now everybody's loved for it. It's like, again, as we keep saying, Brexit and the referendum was a particular time. And really, the last few weeks, I mean, nothing could have foreseen how much this has changed. And this is really now a test of the man as Prime Minister, which has to be more than whether, you can't just have a sort of sense that, people outside London love him, the Red Wall loves him. Because the economy, what's happened to the economy in the last 2 weeks is astonishing. We've nationalised the railway today. People are going to be out of jobs. My own nephew lost his job on Tuesday with 1 week's notice. These are people who don't work in the media. They're not like us, able to work from home. So this will make a massive difference to people who aren't journalists. So I slightly object to the sense that, journalists don't understand that. Some of us are actually related to those people. And it's going to have a massive impact. And Boris needs to be held to account on this as much as anything else.
Let's move on, if we can, to another witness. Dorothy Byrne is currently head of news and current affairs at Channel 4. She has been one of the most trenchant critics of politicians and of Boris. Let's see what she has to say.
It's but a few weeks ago that we were debating the importance of public service broadcasting and whether or not politicians need to speak at length to a mass television audience and then face questioning by journalists. In this, the crisis of our times, we're now all sure of the answers. Television is playing a vital role, probably the vital role, in informing the public and thereby helping to protect the public. We're also helping to bring the nation together as millions upon millions of us sit down each evening to hear the news. And what has been key to the credibility of what we are telling the public is that we are not speaking with one voice. This is not state television spewing out propaganda, but a range of public service broadcasters reporting, analysing and questioning. Television has relayed the government messages fairly and at length, but it has also put forward experts with differing opinions and sometimes shown experiences in hospitals and doctors' surgeries which call some statements into question. All that is essential if the public is to trust us. Only if the public have trust in the news can our society get through this. I hope this will help turn over a new page in relations between television journalists and politicians. We have always needed each other and never needed each other more than now. It's when we find a way of working alongside each other effectively, that we can all be of service to the people. It seems a lifetime away that I wrote about the election television debates. I find when I read what I wrote that it is relevant to thinking about the future, and when a society is in terrible trouble, it's by thinking of the future that we give ourselves the hope to battle through the present. In the chapter, I wrote, the television debates were vital elements in the election campaign, attracting millions of viewers. For the first time in an election, there were head-to-head debates to help voters judge between our potential prime ministers. The 6 primetime UK-wide debates across BBC, ITV and Channel 4 covered a huge range of policies. However, leading politicians limited their appearances and the formats were tightly controlled. Going forward, how can we ensure these debates happen at every election, are less rigid in form, and encourage all our leading politicians to take part? They are not a replacement for in-depth interviews which are needed inside and outside election campaigns. Looking back today, viewing figures across the debates were impressive, demonstrating that television is still overwhelmingly the most important source of information for voters in an election. I thought that on balance the debates were fair, accurate and informative, but I was a bit disappointed that several debates on different channels were pretty similar in content to each other. I don't just say that because Channel 4 did a special climate change debate. I think we would serve viewers better if there was greater differentiation in content. But I don't buy the claim we only talked about Brexit. Other subjects were covered, but even when presenters tried to steer the subject matter away from Brexit, studio audiences raised it. It was hard, arguably impossible, to separate issues of the economy or the health service from the effects of leaving the EU. Obviously, the debates would have helped audiences more if all politicians had appeared in them, but overall, the debates did their job. Television did its job. But now, it's really doing its job. And as I sit in the semi-isolation of an older person on immunosuppressants, I have to salute the journalists across all broadcasters who are out there now doing their bit for our free press and our country.
Jane Martinson, you've got to go off and look after your children. Channel 4 under threat. Has Dorothy got a point there? The politicians don't understand television. It's actually the major medium.
Well, I don't want to sound like a broken record, actually, because I think I would have absolutely said that, and I've written it several times in my column in The Guardian. The fact that the government on December the 13th practically turned on the BBC, and of course on Channel 4, refused to go to the environment debate, and in which Channel 4 put that block aside. The sort of worsening of relationships looked absolutely horrendous for public service broadcasters. What we are viewing figures for TV, or media figures generally, have gone through the roof as people are desperate for information. And TV news in particular has served an incredible need. So, I feel, if anything has come from that, she's right in saying TV and politicians need each other. That should not be a cosy, symbiotic, inside the Westminster bubble relationship at all. But we do need to have, should we have a Prime Minister that picks and chooses, or a government who picks and chooses which outlet they choose, which outlet is friendlier. That way we lead to, and I know there are lots of people listening who may be fans of Fox News, but in the UK, and I generally will say before I leave, I said it earlier, but the BBC has played an incredible role since this started. Tony Hall, who may have made some mistakes in recent years, but has been incredible in coming out very early on and saying this is what the BBC will do to try try to provide information, and they have provided, and it's hugely important serving.
So is the BBC?
So I think it should be a good thing. I hope. We need each other.
Is the BBC in peril?
Do I think the BBC is in peril? I mean, absolutely. I think it was before this started. I now think, I hope, the BBC is only in real peril when the public turn against the BBC. The BBC is still the most trusted news organisation out there, according to every poll. Trust, which is diminishing, but at times like this, I think the support for the BBC can only get stronger. Now, we will see how long this will go on for, but, to me, again, COVID-19 has changed so much in the past week, and that's one of the things. Anyway, thank you very much.
Go protect your children. Ray Snoddy, is the BBC in peril?
John, in the light of what Dorothy Byrne has just said, I'm looking at a question that Gary Gibbon, a contributor to our book, Channel 4 News Political Editor, he put this question to the Health Secretary. Why can't I find a scientist who thinks you're doing the right thing? Now, they haven't lost their chutzpah, Channel 4 News, despite being under political attack. But I totally agree with Jane. In fact, I'd probably go further. This book makes clear, in our book, some of the most distinguished former broadcasters, both ITN, Richard Tate, former chief executive, Phil Harding,
Editor-in-Chief.
Phil Harding, former head of policy at the BBC. They say they've never seen anything like, and this is before the virus, of course, they've never seen anything like the political attacks that the BBC was under a month ago. But I agree with Jane and even some more that the current crisis changes everything, and already at least the ministers responsible for responding to this crisis are creeping back onto the Today programme when they were previously banned from being there, and I think the BBC could actually emerge stronger and more trusted than this government as a result.
Does it have any friends though, Ray? Does the BBC have any friends? Labour doesn't like it. It's part of the Tories don't like it.
Well, that was probably true, but it's usually very ill-informed people who say, you're biased. All studies have shown academic studies have shown there's no evidence whatsoever for institutional bias at the BBC. Perhaps, and this is a conversation for another day, there was a bit of the old false equivalence, on the one hand, on the other hand, rather than a greater need for analysis and greater need for wisdom. But for goodness sake, nothing is perfect. What will everything, as Yeats said, a terrible beauty is born. So that this has changed everything, and we will be more reliant on honest news, factual news, and proper news from organisations like not just the BBC but ITN and Channel 4, and the politicians, if they continue with the petty vendettas of the last month in the future, which I doubt they will, they could be in for a rude awakening.
So will Boris smash the BBC, Ray?
Sorry?
Will Boris smash the BBC, which is what Dom wants to do?
I don't think Dominic Cummings will be with us for as long as as some people think. I don't think they will crush the BBC. The friends of the BBC could come rallying around as a result of this daily demonstration of the importance of a national broadcaster, not a voluntary subscription service for films and dramas like Netflix. There's some in the Conservative Party, and it seems to be like Dominic Cummings, who think the BBC is something like Netflix and Apple TV. It's not. A national public service broadcaster is so much more important than that, and that importance is daily being demonstrated right now.
Let's just play in one last view, which is Professor Stephen Barnett, who's a great friend of the BBC's. If you can stick around, Ray, that'd be wonderful. If the audience will stick around, let's see what Stephen Barnett has to say about the man he calls Johnson and his attacks on the BBC.
Hello, my name is Steve Barnett. I'm a Professor of Communications at the University of Westminster. I'm slightly embarrassed to be here because I gather that I'm standing in for Jon Snow. So I'm afraid rather than someone at the front light of news broadcasting, you have someone who's a bit of an armchair critic. But I will do my best to fill those shoes. One of the issues that I did want to raise, given that the title of this is Boris and Brexit, is that I'm not going to call him Boris, but call him Johnson. I was slightly concerned with the Brexit coverage and the election coverage at the number of times that broadcasters, perhaps unwittingly, would talk about Boris doing this and that, as opposed to Corbyn doing this or that. Or occasionally it was Mr. Corbyn. And I think that matters. Language matters. And there's no question that from his, from the very moment that he was actually standing as mayor, and possibly earlier than that, Boris Johnson exploited the fact that his first name was recognisable and used it as a means of familiarity in a way that I think has no doubt enhanced his own political communication at the expense of his opponents. And although I appreciate that broadcasters feel they need to ensure that their audiences understand who they're talking about and talk in the same kind of terms as voters and the electorate, I also think it's incumbent on broadcasters in particular to exercise a real sense of distance and detachment in the way in which they talk about politicians. Time. So I'm going to be talking about Johnson and the Johnson administration, and actually following on from those comments about unfamiliarity, I wanted to say something about the broadcast coverage at the moment around the coronavirus, because I do think that sense of cosy familiarity, which we saw to some extent during the election campaigns and during the Brexit campaign, I'm afraid we're still seeing now. And it does raise the question of to what extent broadcasters really need to accentuate their sense of detachment and objectivity. I think the current crisis poses a real dilemma for broadcast journalism because there is an inherent contradiction in the job they're trying to do. On the one hand, they have to try and convey accurate, up-to-date information, and by and large it is the government and the government machine that is in charge of that information. So there is a sense in which broadcasters are simply stenographers in the old-fashioned sense. They are simply taking down and disseminating the information that is given them and trying to do it with as much accuracy and implicit faith in what they're being told when they pass it on to the general public. But at the same time, because broadcast journalism is by far the most trusted kind of journalism, way above either online or print media, it is incumbent on broadcasters to be critical, to challenge, to interrogate, and not to take for granted the kinds of things that are being said at press conferences or at briefings, whether off the record or on the record. This is a problem when we have a Prime Minister who is a known liar. And broadcasters are very loath to use those words. All credit to Dorothy Byrne, who has come out and said it. It's to be said. To some extent, I think Channel 4 paid the penalty, but I think it's a penalty worth paying. The problem is that when you have a Prime Minister who has a history of lying, who many people do not see as being open and honest, is even more important that those journalists who are relied upon for accurate information will do what we expect of them and interrogate the things that are being said. So the question that I really have to ask, particularly those broadcasters who are here and who I know are on the front line, and I know it's not difficult, is to what extent that you've done a proper job, particularly around some of those press conferences. I'm thinking in particular of that press conference last week where we were told that the science had changed. Or I think it was actually probably one of the briefings. It was one of the briefings to Laura Kunsberg, I think Robert Peston in particular, maybe Beth Rigby, that the strategy was changing because the science had changed. Now we now know, and anyone who hasn't should read Tim Shipman's article in the Sunday Times today, well, what will now be yesterday, where he describes the agonizing that went on. Now, I'm not suggesting this is an easy. We're not saying this is something that broadcast journalists should have spotted, should have done something about straight away. But when you are given an off-the-record briefing from a government and a prime minister who we know uses them to spin, there surely needs to be a little more distance and a little more interrogation of what's going on behind the scenes. And the fact that we now know was a U-turn. We now know that we were wrong to try and go in a completely different direction to every other country in the world in going down this herd immunity route, and that we're finally catching up. It would have been to the credit of those journalists who were there, rather than simply relaying what they were told in these off-the-record briefings, to have maybe done a little bit more critical distancing. But just to because I don't want to sit here as an armchair critic suggesting that I've got all the answers and those people who are doing the job don't know what they're doing. Quite the opposite. What I'm trying to say is, yes, it's very, very difficult to get the balance right. And we all understand that. I'm just suggesting that for those broadcast journalists who are on the front line, who we rely upon for accurate, up-to-date information, a greater sense of detachment and perhaps more transparency about the sources, about where the information is coming from, I think would help everyone. Let me now just say a little bit about Johnson's systematic assault on the BBC, which kind of precedes the crisis that we're in now, but I don't think is going to go away unless he suddenly becomes a little more grown up than he has been in the past. There is no doubt in my mind that the announcement in the immediate wake of the that there would be another consultation, in inverted commas, on decriminalisation of the licence fee, and that this was all about, as one or two conservative politicians put it, it was all about trying to decriminalise poverty, was a utterly dishonest attempt to undermine and take more money away from the BBC. The idea that that decriminalisation of non-payment of the licence fee was ever anything to do with trying to help the poor rather than undermining the BBC is just completely unsustainable as an argument. And it was clearly a shot across the bows. If it goes ahead, we'll know the results of the consultation, I guess, in 2 or 3 weeks. It'll cost the BBC at least 200 million and possibly even double that. Time when our national public broadcaster is probably more necessary than it has been in a generation. So I suppose what I would like to say is, if this government really wanted to show some creativity, what's important, what's necessary, what everyone agrees is now the worst crisis the world has faced since the Second World War, they can make one obvious gesture, which is to say to the BBC, we will take back payment of the over 75s licence fee. We understand it's the work that you're doing. They could make perhaps some not necessary condition, but a very strong desire that the money that BBC would thereby gain could be put into further news coverage. But it would be a grown-up thing to do. It's not something that I'm afraid I expect from this government. I don't believe it's a grown-up government. One of the problems that I have, if we're comparing the quality of those who are our representatives with those who are reporting what they do, frankly, I would much rather be ruled by the people who are broadcasting the news than those whose news they are broadcasting.
Ray Snoddy, if you're still there, are you? Ray Snoddy, are you still there? Let's just do a quick sum up if we can.
Of Steve's points, there were many good points, but I know it seems crazy to mention this at the moment, but it's very important. The government's, I believe, plan to decriminalise the licence fee. There's a consultation going on, which I think is coming to a close. And in the midst of this crisis, it will be a very easy thing to forget. Decriminalisation of the licence fee would seem like a good idea in theory. It's a terrible idea in practice. 200 to 250 million would cost the BBC straight away, and I think that's only the beginning. As soon as word spreads throughout society that nothing happened to you if you didn't pay the licence fee and you could just watch it all for free, the true bill will be much, much greater. And what would the BBC do? Have to chase millions of people through the civil courts? I don't think that's practical. So if anybody values having a national public service broadcaster and want to keep it in future, they should get in touch with the culture department and point out the consequences of what appears to be their stated policy to decriminalise. What decriminalising means is the first step towards breaking up the BBC, and I would argue, along presumably with Steve Bond, that this is hardly the time to be contemplating such a vindictive right-wing political policy.
Ray, you and I have worked on this book for 15 months, if we can see it. It's been a labour of love. Why should people buy the book?
We got paid a penny.
No, nobody's been paid a penny, not you, not I, none of the 40 brilliant authors. But why should people buy it?
It's a very good book.
In what sense?
It's a very good book. The range, the enormous range of views. We've done, John, been involved in quite a number of these books, and sometimes one reviewer in particular, I remember in the Irish Times, said, but the trouble with, this is a previous book, the trouble is that it doesn't come to a conclusion. That is the very point. It's 40 people's views of particular episodes, a mixture of academics made to write rather faster than they're used to, and journalists who can write quite fast anyway, and the combination is just terrific, because the main academic books on this election and Brexit will come out in about 5 years' time when everyone's forgotten about the whole goddamn thing.
Okay, and a good value at £10?
Excellent value. Cheap at the price.
Very good. All right. Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Jane, if you can still hear us. Thank you, whoever's been listening, for persevering. We had a very rocky first 10 minutes, but you know, that's live broadcasting. We've got to the end. Thank you, and do buy the book. All details on screen now.